So by now you've probably heard of this internet garbage fire that the media has so maturely turned into a Twilight-like, are you Team Cho or are you Team Rucka over the Wonder Woman cover? And this makes me very sad because to me, at the core of this brouhaha is not about Frank Cho's art, is not about Greg Rucka's writing. It's about creators' ability to maintain a certain amount of control over their creations and who actually has final say on covers, internal content, and so on. And I respect both Frank and Greg as talents. Greg disappointed me greatly by blocking me on Twitter after I made comments about what his stance on Wonder Woman is actually saying to women. And some people say he's engaged a block list, some people say he hasn't. Either way, I've been blocked. And Greg, if you're watching this, you might remember me as the woman who approached you at the Calgary Comic Expo dressed as Batwoman. I was one of the first Batwoman cosplayers. I embraced that book. When you were writing it, I walked up and you looked up and said, "Oh, hi, Kay," and I interviewed you. And you told me at the time that your method of writing characters was not write her as a woman. It's she's ex-military, that matters. She's Jewish, that matters. She's queer, that matters. All these elements matter in writing a book. And I understand Greg Rucka has always been sort of critical about cover art he doesn't like. At the time, he complained about the way an artist drew Renee Montoya holding a gun with her thumbs crossed over the back of it, and he's right, it was a mistake. But an editor at DC should have caught that. That's their job, to edit art. But the thing about Wonder Woman is that, yes, the various elements of her character matter, and Wonder Woman has never been an especially modest character. She doesn't come from man's world. This has always been the big thing about Wonder Woman, is that she comes from a single gender race and she doesn't understand the restrictions put on women in our world. That's part of what's been so cool about the character historically. And by insisting that Wonder Woman engage in the same gender-specific education, to talk about some second wave feminist concepts, to assume that Wonder Woman engages in the same modesty paradigms as the rest of us is doing a disservice to the character based on Greg Rucka's own stated methodology for writing characters. This isn't just any female character. This is Wonder Woman. And for many, many years, going back to the origin of the character, Wonder Woman has essentially been in her underwear. The original design was fairly risque, and over time, the skirt got a little shorter to the point that by the 1970s, by the Linda Carter Wonder Woman, she was essentially in a bathing suit. Well, bathing suits are just underwear that go in the water, and so it seems very strange to me, based on the origin of this particular character, that anybody would have issue with Wonder Woman's underwear being visible under a set of armor that was not designed by Frank Cho. The new Wonder Woman design is based more on the movie Wonder Woman, and I think that suit is silly. It's not Frank Cho's fault that that is the costume for DC. Now, when a skirt is just skimming your butt, when you're standing up, you bend over, you're going to see it. You bend over, the pieces of armor fall away. And you get that. Now, if they were to suddenly put Batwoman in a more Wonder Woman type outfit, I would complain about that. Not because it's sexist or it's immodest, it's because it's a violation of the character. Batwoman has no superpowers. She doesn't have magical items gifted to her by the gods. She needs that body armor. So that wouldn't make sense. But the other thing I want to discuss here, which makes it so disappointing, Greg Rucka left mainstream comics in around 2012 and then came back. And I remember supporting him. I was very sad he was leaving mainstream comics because I liked his work at DC. I liked seeing what he did with characters like The Question, like Batwoman. I liked seeing that influence in the DC universe. But he left in 2012, and the reason he gave is very critical to why I'm having trouble with his position now, is that he left because he said, I'm sick to death of the way the big two treat people. And now, fast forward to 2016, he is part of that system that treats people poorly. When DC found out that both creators had been promised creative control or relative creative control over the Wonder Woman variant covers, they should have sat down and worked it out and figured out a way to get through. Because, like it or not, agree with his work or not, Frank Cho was convinced to take this gig under false pretenses. He was told he was only going to report to the variant cover editor at DC, nobody else. And so he had his work approved, and then he had his work censored. And so for a guy in only 4 years to go from, big comics are about serving other masters and having enough, being sick to death of the way the big two treat people, he was part of an editorial system that made someone feel poorly treated. I can't support this. As much as I like Greg Rucka's DC work, I cannot support this. And there's one other thing I want to point out that some people might not realize about why Frank Cho would get so mad that he'd walk off the book about the third Wonder Woman cover. So I've got it up here. You can see the one on the left is zoomed in. The one on the right is not. The one on the right is the original art. The one on the left is what the cover ended up being. Now you'll notice that the little bit of panty peek, anatomically correct, wardrobe correct, panty peek, has been removed by zooming in. The problem with this is this actually creates a mistake when you're doing single character portrait art for a cover in two ways. One of the big things about comic book art is you have to be able to make sure your art lands on a page. It's a rookie mistake for starting with the head being too big so there's not enough space for the rest of the character. And I can understand why a guy like him who is so meticulous would be furious that they actually artificially made it seem like he made an error. But the other thing, you see the finished cover on the top with the Wonder Woman logo and the DC Rebirth thing and the barcode along the bottom, the Wonder Woman 75. The barcode is gonna go right over Diana's little panty peek anyway. So they have actually made it so that the top of the armor when they zoom in is gonna be cut off by the barcode now. So they've actually made a less quality cover, objectively. Not talking about the subject material, it is just a less quality cover. It is improperly done now. It's undermining the variant cover editor too, to take away creative control and give it to the writer of the book. Because as a writer, I have to be aware I know what I want, but I'm not an artist. I do breakdowns and I do minor layouts to communicate with a comic book artist, but I do not tell them their job. And so there have been times I've been like, how do you feel about this? I mean, I've worked with Frank, and at one point, and I can say this because I went through the process with him. He was doing something for me for free. And he interpreted a character, and he drew the character with feet. And the character was not supposed to have feet. And I just said, Frank, this is beautiful, this is great, but her feet are covered by her robes. And he went, oh, and he fixed it. So this is not a guy who can't handle criticism. any criticism at all. He will make a change, even when he's not getting paid. Now, the other thing I want to talk about with Frank Cho and his original work in Liberty Meadows, the stuff I'd originally discovered with Liberty Meadows, I found an incredibly cool, female-friendly, Brandy in Liberty Meadows was one of the most well-rounded female characters in comic books at the time. She was allowed to be quirky. She was allowed to be insecure. She was allowed to be goofy and still beautiful and still sexy and still the object of this, shy veterinarian in Liberty Meadows' affections. But she was allowed to make mistakes. She was allowed to feel sad. She was allowed to do all these things. She was allowed to be klutzy. She was allowed to spaz out. All these things we don't get enough women doing in comic books because it's a male-dominated medium, blah, blah, blah. And so, women are sort of seen as these trophies or these perfected images because it's all about, we're going to put women up on a pedestal and make them seem like the superior sex, like the thing we have to be worthy of. And that's a form of benevolent sexism, and people get very upset. I don't want to get into that now, but it actually isn't equal. Women need to be able to be seen in a lot of different ways. But one of the things I found so funny about Liberty Meadows is there was this character called Dean. Dean was a pig, literally and figuratively. And Dean would go up to these women in bars. This was back in the old college, the early stuff. But Dean would go up to somebody in a bar and say something untoward towards a woman, and the woman would punch him in the face. Now, of course, the men's rights movement would completely freak out over this violence against men now, but that's what it was. It was Dean got punched because Dean deserved to get punched. This is not the work of a misogynist. And the outrage covers are intended to mock the culture war, not women. Now, it just so happens that the images in question that garner all this outrage are of women, but that's not up to Frank, right? And Frank did the same thing I do in those situations. They keep coming after you, they keep screaming, they keep telling you a bad person. Well, you're not a bad person, so you keep doing it anyway. You keep doing your thing. And it's too bad that Frank Cho, he was doing beautiful covers for Wonder Woman. And people were pointing out, one of the reasons I got into Frank Cho's work is Frank was one of the only comic book artists, actually the only comic book artists at the time, who were drawing women who weren't skinny. They weren't just curvy, they were more muscular. They were just bigger women in general. And in an age where, that really skinny, elongated torso Supergirl was sort of the norm, was sort of the zeitgeist, Frank Cho's work made me feel like I was beautiful. And I've talked about this before. And I don't want to say much more because I'm working on some stuff to do more about this. But I wanted to talk about some things that people may not have noticed. And I also wanted to express what made me decide to do this was the disappointment that I got blocked on Twitter. Because the absurdity of a bunch of guys deciding what is appropriate for a woman to be depicted wearing and doing, and then shutting out the voices of actual women saying, by doing this, you're telling us that Wonder Woman, the bathing suit Wonder Woman, for lack of a better term, that we knew and loved and looked up to and saw as this, sort of icon of women's liberation for decades. The message you're sending is, haha, joke's on you. You look like whores. You were dressed like giant sluts. And who says that? Well, the guy writing the comic. And just the guy writing the comic. That DC Comics, the people that owns the license, lets be the arbiter of female modesty regarding Wonder Woman. Not a single expert was consulted. Not a single person who you know, has an awareness of this character, was brought in to break the tie. It was just, well, he has creative control, what he says goes. Even though I'm pretty sure Nicholas Scott is the one drawing the book, which is the height of irony.